Welcome to yet another episode of Shortcast over Coffee. My guest today is Mohit Satyanand. Mohit is an entrepreneur and investor, among many other things. He founded several successful companies, including the major snack food brand Crax and Teamwork Arts, which produces prestigious art festivals, including the Jaipur Literature Festival. He's a consultant and policy expert who is chairman of the Board of Trustees of the think tank Liberty Institute. Mohit has a strong interest in education and macroeconomics policy. He's an avid mountain lover and lifelong trekker, bicycling enthusiast, and an actor. I can go on and on about him for hours, so let me take a pause and get into the conversation. Hi, Mohit. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Bala. Good to be here.
Yeah. So while researching for this podcast, I was in something called that I would like to call the Ajay Shah conundrum because there was so much to unpack. You are an angel investor, you're an entrepreneur, you're a coach, you're a mentor, and you also have received acting credits for for a few web series. That was very interesting to see. The first time I heard about you was through Teamwork Arts, and I found out that your company is behind running the Jaipur Literary Festival. And very recently, I listened to your episode on the Seen and the Unseen about your travel to Bihar, and I was really fascinated by the wealth of experience that you have in a lot of fields, and I thought it will be ideal that you come on the show.
It comes with age, Bala.
Yeah, but then it's not just age, but about people wanting to try different things, and I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about you. I was looking you up, and I realized that your college days coincided with emergency. And it reminds me of the movie Hazaro Khwahishe Aisi. How was that like? And you were in Delhi at the time, so I would love to know more about how times were like.
It was quite chilling because also one was coming of age at that point in time. So you're both very impressionable, which is on the youth side of it, and also very quick to react, which is sort of the adult side of it. So both of those, when I say react, I mean intellectually. And as you said, being in Delhi, and therefore you were surrounded by people of the next generation. So I'm talking about my parents' generation, people who were senior in the media, people who were senior in the government services and the diplomatic services. And it was really chilling to know. I mean, you could hear that change in the tone on the phone when your phone was being tapped. Here I was just talking to an aunt, just a nephew talking to an aunt, but she was a senior diplomat and her phone was tapped. I mean, it was very clear. And then the debate that was going on in the media about whether it's better to come out or to shut down. So you had media which had all manner of responses, some which continued as though nothing had changed, some which, when a piece was censored, carried a blank space on their on the front page, and some which said, look, as long as the emergency is on, we're going to shut down. So you had all three manner of responses. It was, and there were all manner of people who were thrown in jail. So it was very chilling. And on the political side, what happened was that I think it exploded once and for all this notion that there is no alternative, the Tina factor, as it was called. Because when Indira Gandhi decided to hold elections again, And that's a fascinating subject also worth exploring, why she decided to court elections. The question was, but who else is there? And there was this ragtag party. It was a ragtag coalition which came together and threw together a manifesto in a matter of weeks. In fact, it's very interesting that the economic part of the manifesto was crafted right literally under my nose, because it was crafted in the Delhi School of Economics in consultation with my professors, one of whom I was very close to, and therefore one got a great sense of what the thinking was. Of course, it was incredibly socialist thinking. You couldn't have expected anything but. And what was also fascinating was that this particular professor was, of course, very left-wing, but he was also a great aesthete and a follower of cinema and literature and so on and so forth. So I remember on at least 2 occasions being literally dragged out of the corridor and into his room because he suddenly had this insight as to how, into the fact that I should see, for example, Cabaret, which was a film about Germany under the Third Reich. So it was a very fascinating time intellectually. I think the highlight for me was that I think it was probably the first major election speech of the new Janata Coalition that was held literally 100 meters from the front gate of my institution, the Delhi School of Economics. I was doing my MA then, by Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And it was a speech that just set your spirits soaring, because he had that ability to reach out. It was oratory of an extremely high order. And it was just a coincidence that 1977 was also when I turned 21. And it was the first time I cast my vote. And I was able to very, very affirmatively cast my vote against the emergency and the fascist tendencies of Indira Gandhi. So it was a time of great change. It was a great time to become a political actor in the most minimal form in which a citizen is a political actor, by being incentivized to go out and vote.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, it was obviously many years later that I saw a picture of Hindu from the emergency, and they put up a blank editorial page to protest against the emergency. So this change happened one fine day. That one fine day, everything was normal, and then the very next day, everything was just different.
No. It was coming for a long time. So my political awareness is very limited, and even now, when it comes to shifts in political parties and what's happening at the regional level and so on and so forth, it's not my preferred area of interest. But there were a lot of stirrings happening. There was, it basically all began with the Jayaprakash Narayan movement in Bihar and the call for Sampurn Kranti, total revolution. And this was certainly making people like Indira Gandhi extremely insecure. And so I think that sort of reactionary tendency was already beginning. And for her, the last straw was when this court order came against her misusing the perquisites of the prime minister to be campaigning. And that's when she decided enough was enough and imposed the emergency. So you could say it was a reaction to that one court order, but that's being really, really simplistic.
Yeah.
There was this background of acute disaffection in Bihar. So you could say that it began in Bihar.
Yeah, I mean, more than a political standpoint, with respect to just day-to-day activities, there were a lot of limitations. There was like a curfew-like situation. So did you feel like your life
No. At the personal, at the day-to-day level, as a student, it made absolutely no difference in lives. Zero. Zero.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we had a call before this interview, and you were telling me how you worked on the FMCG space quite a bit. Was this right after your graduation from the Delhi School of Economics?
Yeah. So after I finished my master's in economics from Delhi School, I joined Hindustan Lever, now called Hindustan Unilever, which was, as it is now, the largest FMCG company in India. But more importantly, it was widely, almost, I would say, universally considered to have the best management training program.
I think it still
And
does. Yeah, because it's one of the top priorities of IM graduates these days, from what I
right,
understand. Yeah.
right. So this was, of course, 45 years ago,
Mm.
1977. Yeah. So that was the attraction. The attraction was that without having done an MBA, and there's a small backstory there as well. So I decided not to do an MBA in spite of getting admission to IM because I had very late in my undergrad developed a deep interest in economics. So I wanted to pursue that a little bit further, even though I was 95% sure that I wanted to have a career in management. So, I kept both options alive for a while and joined Hindustan Lever as a management trainee in what was kind of a dual track program. So you followed more or less the same training, whether you were an IM graduate or not, except that your training period was 2 years if you didn't have an MBA and 18 months if you have an MBA. I thought that kind of difference was well worth those 2 years that I spent uh, learning about economics. And funnily now, this is the first time I've had this thought, which is the value of conversation, that I think my education in economics is much more valuable to me today than an education in management would have been, because because I think you learn about management being a manager, but I don't think I would have learned as much about economics, which is now a deep passion for me, if I'd done an MBA. But
Oh, that's a great food for thought for future MBA aspirants to learn about the economic side of things. One of the things that uh, my friends who graduated from IIMs and went on to work for Unilever say is that they get to travel a lot while being part of Unilever, and they get to learn about India. I think that's one of their major takeaways. And turns out that people who are ex Unilever, employees go on to, uh, you know, uh, become or do great things in life. That's been one thing. Did you get to travel a lot while working for Unilever, or were you
so
always traveling with?
I worked for Unilever only for 4 years, and so I got to travel very deeply rather than widely, because part of the training was that since your first job as somebody who joined what was then called the commercial stream was going to be as a sales manager. Therefore, you spent about 5 months altogether um, doing the work of the field level people in the sales system. So you worked for 2 months as as what was then called a salesman. I'm sure there's a more dignified title for it now, but it was then called a salesman. And then you work for 2 months as a sales supervisor, who is one rung above. And you did that without any of the perquisites of a manager or a management trainee. So you used the same class of travel, you had the same allowances to live in hotels. You couldn't call them that. They were lodges. And I remember my sales manager, the day before I was to launch on this 2 month journey as a salesman, told me, many management trainees, especially those coming from well-to-do families, stay in hotels which are way outside their allowance because they figure that they have no other expenses and they can use their salary towards that. But that's partly defeating the purpose of this, which is to understand how the salesman lives and how he travels and so on and so forth. So I took that to heart, as I think 90% people do. So I think, those who cheated were an exception, not claiming to be holier than thou or anything like that. And I sat down with the salesman whom I was relieving for those 2 months and took detailed notes from him and stayed in every hotel and ate at every restaurant at which he ate. And this was in the territories of Lucknow and Gorakhpur. So central and east UP. So in a typical month, I would spend 5 or 6 days in Lucknow, which was, of course, extremely comfortable. And the balance, 21 days of a 28-day cycle, would be in towns like Azamgarh, Balia, Basti, Bahraich, and the now famous Gorakhpur. And it was a revelation. It was a revelation to see how poor we were as a nation, even though one knew it intellectually as a student of economics, but what that actually meant in terms of how people lived and what they ate, and the fact that even if you had money in your pocket, and even if I said, my meal allowance is, let's say, I don't remember the numbers, 13 rupees for dinner, there were towns where you could not spend 13 rupees on dinner.
Even if you wanted
because
to.
the only thing that was available was a dry roti and a really thin potato curry. There were some towns where even getting a proper dal was a luxury. And I remember staying in a town, I think it was Azamgarh, where there was actually no hotel. And by hotel, I don't mean, even an Oyo kind of hotel. I mean, a place where a traveler could pay 30 rupees for a room. There wasn't that. I stayed in a Gita Bhavan, and I stayed on the first floor. The room next to mine had no roof, and it was winter, and there was no toilets on the first floor. I arrived there late at night. In the morning, I went looking for a toilet. I won't tell you what I did at night before I went to bed. But in the morning, I went looking for a toilet. There was no electricity. And the toilets were little less than a trough, like a cattle trough in an outhouse in the far end of the compound on the ground floor. And I remember another place where I was told, this was winter, I was told, look, the only place you can sleep in at night is the railway retiring room, which was fine. It was moderately comfortable, but there's no hot water. And if you want hot water to shave, then you should take a mug from the retiring room and go to the engine driver of the train that will go to whatever the nearest town is at 8 o'clock and take hot water from the coal boiler in the engine, which is exactly what I did. I walked to the steam engine and got hot water from the boiler and brought it back. And as I was walking back, I noticed that there were black flecks on the surface of the water, which was coal dust. And I shaved with that. And then when I washed with that, I realized that there were a few black streaks on my face from the coal dust. So I then washed again with cold water. So yeah, it was quite an experience. Quite an experience.
Yeah. I mean, just you talking about it is painting such a great picture. Well, not so great picture in some cases. Uh, how how many states did you cover with Unilever, and what years are we talking about?
So I joined Unilever in August of 77. And I did my training in UP and Punjab over the rest of the year, so August to December. And I then moved to Bombay. And after various trainings in the factory and commercial and marketing, etc., I took on the job of area sales manager for the foods division in the Western Zone. I can't remember exactly when, let's say about a year later, or towards the end of 78. And in that job, as area sales manager, Foods West, I covered Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Goa. But of course, now I was a manager, so I was entitled to stay in 3 or 4 star hotels and traveled by car. I didn't have to stay in retiring rooms, and it also meant that, if there was a small town which you wanted to cover, you didn't spend the night in that town. You were in your car and you drove the car 100 kilometers and visited the distributor, and you went to the nearest big town which had a decent hotel and a decent restaurant and so on. So life was completely different from what it was for those first 4 or 5 months. But it was nevertheless quite an education. And I think during that trip, there were 3 experiences, travel experiences, which I remember very, very clearly. The first was visiting the Raipur-Bhilai Korba belt, and seeing what one had read about as a student of economics, which is heavy industry, huge steel plants, huge coal plants, mining, etc., and how they had these were all public sector undertakings, which were set up in the case of Bhilai steel plant with collaboration with the Russians. So one saw how that whole thing happened, how that technology was imported, and you could even see how the architecture was imported. It was brutal Russian-style architecture. So that was something of insight. In an adjacent area, I visited Bastar, which was then part of Madhya Pradesh. Now, of course, it's a separate state, the state of Chhattisgarh. But I saw tribal India, and it was a different world. There was something quite romantic about it. I think urban people are prone to romanticizing the tribal life, and I know that it carries a very, very deep burden of poverty and uncertainty and so on and so forth. But yet, to the aesthete, there is a romanticism in it. That closeness to nature, the depth of the forests, people walking long kilometers to get to the market having all kinds of very, very primitive produce, fowls and vegetables, and so on and so forth, and a certain amount of primitive art. It was, to the aesthetic, it was profoundly appealing. What it means in reality, I know, because subsequent periods in my life, I've traveled in the tribal areas as somebody working with NGOs and trying to understand the kind of services that these people are getting, their economic situation, and so on. That's really, that's a different story. But at that point in time, to this impressionable young man of 22, there was a certain romantic beauty to it. And the third was a visit to Goa. It was my first visit to Goa. I don't think there's any person from our kind of socioeconomic background who doesn't go to Goa every year or every couple of years. And I'm certainly guilty of that. But at that point in time, again, talking about 78, Goa had not been liberated for too long from Portugal. And there was something exotic about Goa. it still had that Portuguese influence. And I remember the hotel I stayed in, which still carried very, very stark swatches of paint from the Portuguese era. Some of the notices were in Portuguese. The food was, the menu had both English and Portuguese in it. And some of our dealers still had the Portuguese names. And all of Goa went to sleep between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, the South European siesta. So if I was out working in the market with my salespeople, we would start at whatever it was, 9:30 or 10, and then go and have lunch from 1 to 2 or 2:30, and I would actually go to the beach and have a swim. But we would then meet again at 3:45 or 4. So it's not very important in terms of understanding India, but it just left a very deep impression on me. There can be this little enclave of Europe, which is just an hour's flight away from Bombay.
Yeah, fascinating. You touched upon the tribal landscape in Chhattisgarh. I mean, the now Chhattisgarh, erstwhile, not erstwhile, but like Madhya Pradesh earlier. I have this thought about preserving tribal culture and, letting tribals live the way they are, and so on. Um, I I have this thought that, even though preserving culture and traditions is really important, somehow we make them exotic, but we don't let them see or enjoy the privileges of life that we do. And for city dwellers and the privileged class, they are always exotic. We just visit them for 3-4 days, stay in an exotic or fancy hotel 50 kilometers away, visit the tribal spot, and come back. And what are your thoughts on that? Is it important to, bring them to, I'm just going to use the word civilization, or let them be.
This is a very difficult discussion.
Right.
That's not by way of saying that I don't want to get into it. But I think the particular is very different everywhere. So you can take an extreme example of the Jarawas in Andaman, who made it very clear, very violently clear, that they don't want anybody on their territory. And I think that's that. As a nation, you are somewhere constitutionally respect the freedom of the individual and therefore of the community. And if the community decides that they don't want anybody encroaching on their territory, so be it. But I think that's a very marginal discussion.
Yeah.
To me, discussions about preserving culture, that's a very top-down approach. I think culture is something which is inherent to a people, and what they choose to inhabit, what they choose to retain, what they choose to import, what they choose to expose themselves to. These are all very deep individual stroke community choices. So, to take again a very, very simplistic example is that of fusion music, So Dr. L. Subramaniam doesn't become less of a great Hindustani, a Carnatic classical violinist by playing along with John McLaughlin. And he informs John McLaughlin, and John McLaughlin influences him, and then you throw in a Hindustani percussionist like Zakir Hussain, and so that's a very, very, very fertile ground. Whether or not you like the Mahavishnu Orchestra that came out of it is a personal thing. But what I'm saying is that I think that's the way culture needs to be approached. Like everything else, I'm fairly radical on this front. It needs to be approached from a completely free and libertarian point of view. And these are individual choices. But coming back to tribals, I think the issue there is a much, much deeper one, and one which is at the heart of a lot of conversations which are happening today. And there is the legal issue, and there is the larger environmental issue. And you could also frame a third question, which is the question of to whom does the land belong? Okay. So let's start with that. To whom does the land belong? So you could take one extreme position, which is that the sole occupants of large tracts of forest, hundreds of thousands of acres, for thousands of years were the tribals. And therefore, those forests belong to them. Okay. But when the Brits came in, land was governed by the British law tradition, which is what is called res nullis, which means that if land doesn't belong specifically to any individual or institution, it belongs to the king, right? And therefore, by one stroke of the British imperial court, all forest lands, except those which were privately owned, belonged to the king or queen of England. And then India became a free nation, but everything that belonged to the king now belonged to the government. And so the tribal lands all belonged to the government. Because these lands had never been cultivated, therefore they were of no revenue value, and therefore there was no title to this land. Agricultural land had revenue value, and therefore the British administration, the colonial administration, awarded pattas, they awarded title, and against that title they collected rent. They didn't do that in tribal areas. They valued the tribal forest land for its forest produce. And therefore, so now when India became independent and all the pattas passed from the colonial administration to the administration of the Republic of India, the forest dwellers had no rights in their land. And they were always at the mercy of the forest department. And this then started becoming an issue. And it was fought, as always, by activists. And in this particular case, largely by two sets of activists who were working in parallel without really knowing each other, one in Gujarat and one in Maharashtra. And Maharashtra was an incredible Jesuit priest who gave up his priesthood in order to work with the tribals. A gentleman whom I had the tremendous privilege of knowing quite well, called Pradeep Prabhu. And he took up the case of tribals in the Thane district and argued the case himself through the Maharashtra High Court and then the Supreme Court. And there was another group of people working with tribals in the Bharuch district of Gujarat. And eventually, firstly, the case was won in the Supreme Court that forest dwellers need to be given rights to the land which they have cultivated. And then, realizing that the game was up in a sense, a Forest Rights Act was enacted in the Parliament. Without going into the details of it, it said that if you could prove that you had been farming this land for X number of years, you could get a patta but only of up to 5 acres. Okay? But at least it was a beginning. Because firstly, it recognized that they were the rightful owners of that land. B, along with ownership of land, your access to other rights also becomes a lot easier. You know, your You're titled to the house in which you live, and the general respect that you get in the community by being not landless, but an owner of land changes. But the pace at which the Forest Rights Act was actually enforced, and the kind of trouble that tribals had in getting their land rights recognized and getting that patta, it's just incredible. Because there's no real political or administrative will to do it. I don't know the latest figures, but I worked quite closely with this group in Gujarat for a few years, helping raise money and awareness and helping them with adopting GIS technology to actually map the land and submit the pattas and so on and so forth. So I think more than the cultural issues, I think it's the economic issues which need to be sorted. And I forget exactly when the Forest Rights Act was enacted. I think it was 2004, 2005. It's getting on to 20 years now. And we're still nowhere near universal recognition of these land titles. I suspect it's somewhere around the 40-50%.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fascinating. I thought I knew the areas that you were an expert in, but it turns out that you have worked with um, so many different things as
No,
I
I'm not an expert in this at all, Bala. It's just something that caught my
no,
caught
not
the
not
compassionate human side of me, and I got involved for a while.
yeah, but it's great that you did. Yeah, coming back to India pre 1991, when you were traveling as a part of Hindustan Lever and beyond Lever, did you see a stark difference in the north-south states back in those days? Because India was fairly uniform from what I have read. Um, was a UP similar in economic conditions with a Maharashtra or an Andhra Pradesh? What was your experience like in?
Actually, the biggest difference that I could see in my limited exposure was between um, Punjab and UP. They were and the fact is that Punjab was the richest state in the country at that point in time.
Yeah.
And UP was not the poorest, but was among the poorest. Bihar was always worse off than. So that difference was very, very stark. Rural Maharashtra was very poor, as was tribal and rural Madhya Pradesh. So, but as I said, the conditions were different. The way in which I traveled in rural Maharashtra was very different from the way in which I traveled in rural UP. So I felt the poverty of rural UP much more than I did in Maharashtra. But I would say it was worse. I would say even then, especially Eastern UP, was just incredibly poor. It was really dirt poor. And in comparison, at that point in time, Punjab literally did feel like the land of milk. There was everything was green, and there really was milk wherever you went, and sugarcane. And for me also, it was sort of, even though I didn't grow up in Punjab, our family was or is Punjabi by blood, and it was just nice to be in that environment and to speak that language and be part of it. So, I think the kind of north-south divide that now exists in terms of both economic and social progress, that didn't exist then. And during that time, I hardly traveled in the 4 southern states. All my travel was either north or west. And there was not a big divide at that point. It was Punjab that stood right on top of
Yeah.
whole part.
Many years later, did you get a chance to visit Eastern UP, and did you see any difference? The reason why I'm saying this is, I went uh, for an undergraduate degree in NIT Jamshedpur, and I'm originally from Kerala. And what was really fascinating was I was taking a lot of things that I had in Kerala for granted until I visited Jamshedpur. I did grow up for a bit in Calcutta, but then Calcutta is a city, so it's quite different. But apart from Jamshedpur, which was a significant level up from the rest of Jharkhand, I did get an opportunity to go to other cities in Jharkhand. So what I noticed was, this is like 2010 and 2011. What I noticed was if you take off mobile shops, shops that sell SIM cards, it was still in the 1960s and 70s. The buses were from the 1970s. The trucks were from the 1970s. Some of the roads were from the 1970s. So it was quite a revelation for me. So yeah, and
So
it's
I haven't been back to Eastern UP, but over the last 3 years, two places where I've been. One is, as you talked about earlier on, was Bihar, and I spent 5 or 6 days in Bihar, and we actually stayed in very small towns. Two towns, one was Saharsa and one was Purnia, and these are both in the northeastern part of Bihar. And there was a map out recently which shows multidimensional poverty. And both of these districts that we were in have probably the highest incidence of multidimensional poverty in India, around 50% of the population. And you could see it. And so I walked around the town of Saharsa with my friend, the economist Kumar Anand, whose family is from Saharsa, and we stayed in his parents' house. And this was the question which I asked him, how much it changed. And so we did the same kind of inventory as you're talking about. And if you remove the shop selling SIM cards, there was nothing much else that was different except for one thing, which was that there was a public garden which was attached to I think the municipal offices. And 2/3 of that garden had been given on long-term rent to entrepreneurs who were running banquet halls for weddings. And so they'd become sort of Bharat gardens, if you were. And the decor there, that very kitschy decor and blend of artificial and real flowers and so on. That could have been from any big city, from the poorer part of a big city. And the third thing, which was new, which I hadn't seen in the 70s and 80s, was beauty parlors. Beauty parlors are ubiquitous in India. They didn't exist 40 or 50 years ago. So I think these are the three big changes. The shop selling mobile phones and SIM cards, the marriage halls, and beauty parlors.
And now we are in 2023, and I just want to quote Shashi Tharoor here, that for every rupee UP gives in tax, it receives 1.79 rupee back. Tamil Nadu apparently puts a rupee and gets 30 to 35 paise back.
And Bihar is 4 rupees. Bihar is almost 4 rupees, 3 something.
4 rupees. Yeah. One of the first times that this really struck me was I don't remember the year, but Mamta Banerjee was presenting the budget. And uh, we had a minister from Kerala who was the Minister of State for Railways. And there was a huge demand for trains in Kerala. Uh, like, definitely the Kochi Bangalore route was one of the most popular ones. And, we wish that there were more trains in that route. What happened was the number of trains that UP and West Bengal got, and these were the years when Mamta Banerjee was the railway minister, and then Lalu Prasad Yadav was the railway minister, or the other way around. Everything was, Howrah Nagpur, Howrah Bangalore, Howrah. So what I'm trying to say is there is so much of investment in Bihar and UP. I don't know if this is the right investment, adding more trains and so on. But where do you think the gap might be? When the center gives, like you said, 4 rupees to Bihar, it's just not getting invested properly, or where where is the gap?
So I think there are two ways to look at this. I think the first thing is to pull up a map which shows population density. And when you see the enormous population density along this sort of arc, which goes from Delhi, literally following the Ganga, through UP, Bihar, and eventually to West Bengal. And if you actually drive through West Bengal, there are parts of West Bengal where the population density is even higher than in Bihar. So the fact that you need that kind of infrastructure to service those kind of populations, I think that's a given. The second issue is, what does it mean to be a nation? Now, if you look at the US, for example, the gap in per capita income between the poorest state and the richest state is about 2:1. So the poorest states, which are in the Northeast, Massachusetts, New York, they're all in the $67,000 to $70,000 a year range. And if you look at the poorest states, they're in the South, Mississippi, Louisiana. I don't remember the exact figures, but they're in the low 30s. Gap is about 2.2, 2.3:1. Now in India, and that's what led me to Bihar, the per capita income of Bihar is $640 per annum. That's a crazy number, even in absolute terms. And this is the arithmetic mean, right? So somebody who's numerate, you know that if you have an unequal distribution, then if the mean is 640, the median is probably 400. A very, very large number of rural Biharis will be living on $400 per capita per year, which is a staggering number. In all of Asia, there are only 4 countries with a per capita income of less than $1,000. And they are Yemen, which is war-torn, Syria, which is war-torn, Afghanistan, which was torn apart by war for decades, and North Korea, because we don't know what the per capita income there is. So it's quite staggering that a state of 130 million people in this country, which wants to call itself the fastest growing nation in the world, etc., should actually have a per capita income which is at the bottom of any pile that you construct, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in the world, whatever it is. On the other side, you have Goa, which has a per capita income of about $7,000. So the gap is like more than 10:1. And you can exclude Goa, say it's a small state, and take, Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, which are like 5,000. Anyway, the point is that these are factors of 7, 8, 10, 12 times. As a national leader, wouldn't you like to equalize this number? Wouldn't you like to bring the experience of being Indian sort of more towards the center, if you believe that leadership can influence the economic well-being of people? And unfortunately, economics is a very complex subject, and economic policy is even more complex in a federal union. What is the state that the central or the union government can play? What is the role that state governments can play? How much of state politics is defeating economics? These are all very, very relevant questions, and questions that I came up hard against when I traveled in Bihar. You could say that a lot of the policies in Bihar are self-defeating and are going to result in it continuing to be at the bottom of the pile. But if you are a union of states, then part of your economic goal has got to be to try and lift the poorest parts of the nation. This doesn't prevent the political question coming from a Kerala or a Karnataka that is that money that, in a sense, is going out of our pockets to Bihar, is that being well spent? That's equally a legitimate question. And I'd be the first person to ask that question on behalf, not just of those who are living in Kerala and Karnataka, but also as someone who, in his personal capacity, pays a lot of tax. Is that money being well spent? It's a question that I would ask at the level of the union government. Is inaugurating two convention centers in Delhi, one costing 3,000 crores and one costing 5,400 crores in a week, is that going to yield a return on our investment or not? And does the Bihar government spend its money well or not? These are all questions that all of us are entitled to ask, not just from the perspective of a north-south divide, which is a very real divide, and is going to be increasingly a question that cannot be solved. It cannot be solved over the next 10 or 20 years. What we've seen is the distance in both socioeconomic indicators and pure commercial ones. The distance between a Bangalore and a Patna is only widening. It's not closing. And the distance between Bangalore and Pune district is also widening. It's not closing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned in the podcast with Amit Verma is that none of those cities had a 5-star hotel, and Tata's Ginger was.
There's only one city. Only one city which is Patna, and that too at that point in time when we were there, it did not have a 5-star.
Yeah. One of the things that I noted while I was in Jharkhand was the situation of youth. So when it comes to education, almost everybody just moves to Delhi. If they want to do an arts degree or a philosophy degree, economics degree, they just move to Delhi, and a lot of them write the West Bengal entrance exam for engineering, and I think there is some percentage of quota for people from Bihar and Jharkhand, and people who don't make it just come to Vellore or Bangalore for their engineering degree. So looks like anyone who graduates the 12th board exams just moves out of state, and I think that's also the retention of youth is also a problem.
No. So what you're saying is absolutely true, but it represents probably 0.1% of youth.
Yeah, I have to agree, because these are all the economically, upper middle class. Yeah, I have to.
No, not upper middle class. Upper class.
Upper
because
class.
you've got to define upper and middle and so on by the distribution. not by an absolute number. So people like this represent the top 0.1% of Bihar. Again, without getting too data heavy, and I don't remember the numbers offhand, but if you look at the progression of young people from primary school to secondary, from secondary to college, it's true across this nation that now you have almost universal enrollment in primary schools, but the progression to secondary and then on to higher education, that whole chain, the drop-off and the thinning of that chain is sharpest in Bihar, sharper than almost anywhere else in this country. And then the percentage of those who actually graduate from college and look for higher education, whether in law or writing the UPSC exams or whatever, is again really, really, really minuscule. The situation in Bihar is that, as you may remember from the podcast, within what greeted us as we checked into our budget business hotel, which was the only brand name hotel in Patna, was a group of young men. Strangely, there were no women, and I did try and ask about that, who had written and cleared the exam for Bihar government school teachers, but they'd not got their appointment letters for 4 years. So these were young and not so young men, ranging from sort of 27, 28 to mid-30s, who'd never worked a day in their lives. They had, in some cases, written the exam 2 or 3 times before clearing it. They prepared for the exam for a year or two, and now 4 years later, even though they'd qualified, they'd not got their appointment letters. Similarly, if you were to look at the Bihar, whatever it's called, state services, the state equivalent of the UPSC, again, those numbers are crazy. 4 lakh people, 8 lakh people register for the exams, 4 lakh write them, and the previous year, 280 people had got jobs. You're talking of fractions of percent, you're not even talking percentages. So that is the situation in Bihar, that the unemployment among the youth is pathetic. It's really, really sad. It's also true that those who are academically or intellectually ambitious do believe that their future lies outside.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough spot that Bihar is in now, and hopefully things change. Mohit, what fascinates me is you started one of India's or the first successful snack brand outside of the big corporations. How was the scenario to start a business pre 1991 versus post 1991? And I would love a first-hand narrative if you can.
Yeah. So it was, as somebody who'd grown up in the 60s and 70s, you took state control for granted. You didn't question it. You railed against it, but you took it for granted. And you realized that if you wanted to do something, you got to deal with the system. So there was never the kind of frustration and intellectual angst that I have with the license Raj today, because it still persists. At that point in time, you just took it for granted. That was the way the world functioned, And it was a world in which it took 7 years to get a phone and 3 years to get a motorcycle. And so you just lived with it. But the one thing that struck me as really, really, really comic. Okay? So there was this there was this technology for manufacturing snack foods, which is called extrusion technology. It was unknown in India. We didn't have a single extruded snacks plant at the time. And it was something that I found fascinating for the novelty of what it could produce and how it lent itself to intense flavoring and so on and so forth. And so that's what I settled upon. And this was a choice made after 2 separate trips and visiting not too few plants and manufacturers in Europe, the US, and Southeast Asia, and having to educate myself about snack food processing, machinery, etc., etc., etc. Today you would say, okay, where do I find a young person who understands snack food processing and bring them on board and give them some equity, so on and so forth. At that point in time, there was no such thing. You started from scratch, you educated yourself. And as a process of all of these visits and all of this reading and so on and so forth, you decided that this is the machinery that I want to import, right? But before you get in, so now you have to get an import license, okay? Anything that you wanted to bring in, there was an import license. Now, the license was not just about getting the foreign exchange to bring in the plant. It was also the government in its all-knowing Vishnu-like avatar that decided whether you were bringing the appropriate technology from the appropriate manufacturer to make this. Now, there was a department called the Directorate General of Technical Development, which was the my bap when it came to deciding whether this was the plant that you should import. And the officer at the DGTD, he was a very nice man. I actually quite liked him. And his knowledge of technology was no more or no less than mine. In general, I'm saying some people understand technology, some don't. I, despite having trained in economics, had a scientific bent of mind. I could say that this guy had he understood technology at some very, very general level. But I don't think he was an IIT grad or anything. I think, like me, he was, commerce or whatever it is. Now, this gentleman was the arbiter of whether the snack food technology that I was bringing in as embodied in this plant was appropriate. He knew nothing about it. And there's no way that he was going to spend a year of his life trying to understand snack food. That's what I'd done, right? I visited Thailand, Singapore, France, UK, and 4 states in the US. Italy, in fact, I finally bought the plant from Italy. And so basically, I gave him cyclostyled or whatever it was, and photocopied pages of a couple of chapters from a book that was the Bible of extrusion technology. The brochures of this company from which I was importing that technology, which was a company called Mapimpianti, and brochures of a couple of other companies which I had interacted with, showing why the Mapimpianti technology was better suited to what. And his job then became, for a consideration, obviously, his job became to rehash all that I had given him into a report, which now sort of pretended that the DGTD understood extrusion technology and had therefore decided that we were making the right technological choices. Okay? So it was a farce of the highest order. And like I said, he was basically a nice guy. And therefore, it was not too fraught. But of course, I was also very naive because every company, irrespective of how big or small it was, and I was doing this under the umbrella of a company that was into, it had a flour mill. So it was processing wheat into atta and so forth. And so they had one very senior employee whose job was liaison. He was a liaison guy. And so I said, no, this gentleman is a very nice gentleman. So he looked at me like I was a child, which I was. I was all of 26 or 27 then, and said he may be very nice, but nothing is done for free. But even he was really rattled when he came back from negotiating with this guy. And I guess he had a sense of what gets paid for what kind of permission and what kind of license. And he came to me and he was literally blustering. He said, and I'll say it in Hindi and then translate. He said, "In logon ke liye to tankha chutney ke barabar hai," which means that the salary you get from the government is just the sauce on the side. The meat and the bread comes from entrepreneurs like you and me. So this was the reality then. And two other colors to that reality. The first is that every time I traveled to look at machinery, to look at markets, etc., 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 I had to get foreign exchange from the Reserve Bank of India. Couldn't buy a foreign exchange just like that. Foreign exchange was a rare commodity. And to get foreign exchange from the Reserve Bank of India, the Delhi office of Reserve Bank of India had no permission. You had to apply to Reserve Bank of India in Bombay. So that means for every trip that I went, the same gentleman who looked after liaison had to first go to Bombay, spend 3 or 4 days there, get my application for foreign exchange processed, and that application for foreign exchange determined whether your daily allowance was $155 or $125 or $110, depending on your designation in the organization.
So he gets to decide. Wow.
No, there was a schedule which said if you're managing director, then it's $155, and if you're general manager, it's $140, and if you're general manager, then it's and so on and so forth. So yeah, the Babu decided.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, I wonder how many entrepreneurs, how many bright minds lost how many years in that time frame, pre
Oh,
1990.
absolutely. This was one part of it, and the other part of it was also short-lived capital. So, we were very short. We were very capital short. And then the third thing, which is that, because we were capital short, talent counted for something. And, at the age of 20, let me be exact over here, 1981. Yeah. So at the age of 25, I left the Sun year after 4 years and set up this business. But like I said, it was not my money. You either came from a business family or you didn't. There was no middle ground. And so they paid me well, they gave me a lot of freedom, but I had no equity. They promised me a 1% profit share. And I joke, which is that if then was now, or now was then, would own probably 60% of that company when it went to IPO, right? But because of the way capital availability has changed, but at that point in time, when the company went to IPO, I had 0% equity in it. So that's how much times have changed.
Yeah, and I think in a good way, the coming of internet also helped quite a bit. Even though we uh, caught up much later than, let's say, the US, but I think it was the right time. Liberalization and the internet, and with this whole digitization, things have gotten so much easier. Uh, Great. After those heavy topics, I want to move to something lighter. You told me that you are a mountain man, and you have this love for the Himalayas. And uh, I got to listen to podcast where you said that you lived between 97 and probably the early 2000s without a phone up in the mountains. What was that all about?
Yeah, so I'm in that very village right now,
Ah, okay.
recording this. And yeah, so and I'm not sure whether it's a great thing that I'm sitting over here and have this kind of access, because I often think about this, that the distance between my life in the mountains, where I still spend a fair amount of time, and the city is now very short. Um, the distance in terms of behavior and habits and so on and so forth. At that point in time, it was a completely different world. And one of the reasons for that was a complete lack of communication. Um, if I wanted to speak to anybody in Delhi, I had to walk 10, in those days, yeah, 8 or 10 minutes, because I was young and fast, down from our cottage to the road, and then drive 6 kilometers on an unpaved road to the paved road, and then drive on a narrow paved road for another 20 minutes, and then meet the single lane paved road going up to Almora. And that was the nearest place where I could make a phone call. So it was a 1 hour travel to make a single phone call. And the nearest bank was an hour away, and the nearest petrol pump. And um, so the only news I would get was when I went to Almora, and the guy who owned the newsstand had instructions that between this visit and the next one, just keep the Economic Times and the Times of India, one copy every day. And often he wouldn't, but I would typically come back with 6 or 7 newspapers. I would go every 2 weeks. So what was it like? It was romantic in the extreme. It was incredibly beautiful because of its isolation. And I think um, um, we were both very adventurous. We were so adventurous that we didn't feel like it was an adventure. And that's the extreme of adventure. When you're doing something which is so adventurous, but you don't feel like it's this is life. This is the life we've chosen. It's a gorgeous life. And luckily, we also never had a mishap, never had a major mishap, in those 6 years. We had a couple of minor mishaps. Our dog was attacked by some kind of wild animal, probably a leopard, because there were leopards. We could hear them. We did on one occasion. Attacked by a wild animal, had his throat ripped open, but we were actually able to save him. And I think that's the most we kept well for all of those 6 years. Never once did any of us require any major um, medical intervention, which would have been really tough because the nearest hospital was an hour and a half away, and not a hospital that I would have liked to be in either then or now. And our son was born while we lived here. We did go on medical advice to Delhi for the delivery, which was just as well because he had a few complications. There were a few complications during delivery and post-delivery, but nothing major. Neonatal ICU for about 10 days. But after that, his life was absolutely normal. And so there was this thing in our time and in our family that a child doesn't leave home for 40 days. And but on the 42nd day, we got into our car and drove up to the mountains. And we lived here till he was just 5 years old. So he learned to read and write here in our front lawn, in the shadow of Nanda Devi, and he grew up in nature. And the one thing that was so funny, the one thing that I was very determined was, despite the fact that we live in the mountains and there's no easy swimming to be had, he must learn how to swim. And my wife said, we're living in the middle of the village, and we don't try to disguise the fact that we're city people who have more money than they do, but a swimming pool is like really putting us apart from everybody else. And I could see that. So we built an irrigation tank. And we didn't tile it or anything like that. We just built an irrigation tank. And as I just want him to grow up without a fear of water and being comfortable swimming. And so he learned to swim in that tank, and now loves to swim, and actually qualified for a diving license before he was 12 years old. So, so that little sort of decision went a long, long way. And he actually got himself an advanced open water diving certificate by the time he was 15, and is much more proficient diver than I am. So, it was incredibly romantic. It also bred a degree of closeness between the three of us, because it was just the three of us, 24 hours a day. I mean, we had friends and we did have some English-speaking city-bred friends in the broader area. Somebody was 7 kilometers away and somebody was 40 kilometers away. It's not like we were living in each other's homes. We would meet them from time to time, but 6.5 days a week, that was our life. In the middle of the forest, in this stone and wood house, which was built by the local masons, based on a drawing which I did on a chart paper. So there was no architect, no engineer, nothing. It was just this very simplistic design built with stone and wood, and that's where we lived. So things have changed a lot in this village. Quite a few people city people have set up second homes here and so on. And we still hark back to the old, and our house is still very, very much in that sort of idiom. It's all stone and wood and mud plaster. So what you see behind me, the walls, it's mud plaster. It's not cement and paint and so on. So it was very good, very good.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy how much I learned while talking to people. And the reason why I say this is I had a conversation with CAL FIRE, which is California Department to Fight Wildfires, and I was talking to a chief from there, and I was asking him what are the worst cities to live in terms of fire danger in California, and he was telling me a few names in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and I asked him, why do people live up in the mountains? Why, when it's so isolated with the fire danger? And he told me that they just love it. They love the isolation. And for a city dweller like me, it didn't make sense yesterday, but it's amazing how quickly things turn. And I think when you sort of romantically talk about the mountains and your life in the mountains, it makes sense to me now. But thank you so much, Mohit, for being on the show. We barely touched the surface. I had so many things on my list with Jaipur Literary Festival, startup and all of that, but we could barely touch the surface. So, but thank you so much for being on the show. We may have a repeat.
My pleasure, Bala, and all the best with your ongoing series of podcasts. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much.